Now, the Three Martini Lunch with Greg Corombos and Jim Garrity.
And welcome, everyone, to the Wednesday edition of the Three Martini Lunch. Daniel Foster, contributing editor at National Review Online, is in for the cruising Jim Garrity today. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Today is a National Day of Mourning. If you haven't had the chance to watch right now, as we're recording this, the Bush funeral is going on. I would certainly encourage you to do that sometime today. Depending on what happens at the service, it may or may not be discussed on Thursday's Three Martini Lunch. We also want to let you know today that we're once again sponsored by Hopsy. Right now, go to tryhopsy.com/martini and use the promo code Martini to get the sub-home draft machine, the 2 mini kegs of beer, the 2 Hopsy glasses, and free membership in the monthly beer club for $99. But Dan, as we bid a solemn farewell to a former president, the 2020 field is shaping up a little bit. That will consume our good and our crazy martini today for people who are not seeking the Democratic presidential nomination. So now we're down to just a couple thousand people who are likely to run and challenge Donald Trump in the year 2020. First of all, the good news, this is from Politico. Former Massachusetts Governor Deval Patrick is calling close allies and informing them he is not running for president in 2020. Sources close to the governor tell Politico. Patrick informed staff and advisors of his decision Tuesday, with an announcement to come as soon as this week. A close ally of former President Barack Obama, the Democrat rejoined the private sector at Bain Capital after serving 2 terms as Massachusetts governor. But he ramped up his political activity this fall in advance of a possible presidential bid, traveling to a handful of races across the country. Close advisors to Patrick launched a new political action committee in August, the Reason to Believe PAC, aimed at promoting Governor Patrick's positive vision for Democrats to rally around in 2018. So there's obviously different factions of the Democratic Party here, Dan, and he's kind of from the Obama wing. And just yesterday, we got the statement from Joe Biden that he's going to make a decision in a couple of months and that he thinks he's the most qualified person. So I don't know if that was the not so subtle signal for all others in this faction of the party to think again before getting in against Joe Biden. But ultimately, Deval Patrick, I think, could have been a pretty compelling candidate, certainly for the Democratic base, in terms of his ability to communicate, in terms of his ideology. So the fact that he's not running might be a good thing for Republicans coming up in 2020.
Yeah, I'm of two minds about Patrick's potential strength. On the one hand, everything you said is true, and he does represent the same kind of wing of the sort of mainstream left part of the Democratic Party that Biden does. So, it'll be interesting to see who kind of gets that slot. If your theory of 2020 on the Democratic side, as mine sort of is by default, is that there'll be a representative from the mainstream wing and a sort of super progressive left culture warrior representative, and then, an old school sort of old left Marxist like Bernie or one of his acolytes as the 3 sort of front runners. It's interesting that Patrick won't occupy one of those slots. On the other hand, he's talked about as a sort of disciple of Obama, but he's also, in my view, what would happen if Obama and Mitt Romney had a love child? Because, of course, there's the Massachusetts, connection. Patrick, succeeded Romney as governor of Massachusetts and implemented Romney Care. But there's also, of course, the Bain Capital connection. And that is not something that is going to play, to say the least, with really charged up Democratic primary voters. So I don't know if he would have been able to overcome that. There's also, I think, although it'll never be directed at Obama himself, there's a sort of anger among the sort of young progressive base of Democratic voters about what they view as the kind of failures of Obamaism, or the sort of unkept promise that Obama would deliver a kind of personal, kind of permanent transformation of the electorate, of the way we do politics, of the way sort of national politics works. And I don't know if there would be an appetite among those voters to revisit it in the person of someone who's kind of a, B squad Obama. So I don't know how strong he would have been, but he's certainly, as you said, a very capable communicator, very mainstream, and a good fundraiser, and would have had a lot of rich friends. So that makes you a contender.
Yeah, interesting that Deval Patrick, as far as I know, Dan, has never been accused of giving people cancer, despite his affiliation with Bain Capital. So chalk that one up to the media having slightly different views of folks at Bain Capital, depending on their political views.
He reformed Bain. It was all cancer before he got there.
Deval Patrick, I'm sure, will be active in some way for the 2020 campaign. But in the meantime, he can kick back and have a beer. And everybody knows that the only way to get beer at its best is straight from the tap. And Hopsy brings beer on tap to the comfort of your own home without the price tag many beer drinkers have come to expect. You can have your own beer bar at home with the Sub. And the Sub is a countertop appliance that fits neatly in your kitchen, bar, or living room.
That's right, Greg. Think of Hopsy as an espresso for beer or a Keurig for beer. Whether you're a hophead, a malt mouth, or a palate partier, and I'm any one of those three depending on the day of the week, you can enjoy a variety of beer styles from big and small breweries, rotating monthly. Their IPAs are very popular, for instance. Hopsy partners with a long list of breweries and ships mini kegs to your home or office.
Now, Jim Garrity's on the cruise. He told us last week he wasn't taking his Hopsy with him, which is, I think, a mistake. But his Hopsy is at home. He's tried it out for a number of weeks now, and he loves it. Jim is pretty selective in his beer tastes, and that's a good thing if you have Hopsy because they have such a wide variety of options for you. He likes the port and the stout. They've got ales as long as your arm, and they've got IPAs, as Dan just said, which are very popular as well. And so this is something, regardless of your taste, that's going to work well, and it's a great conversation piece. If you want one for your Christmas party, if you just want one to have on the weekend and kick back with a few friends, each keg is the equivalent of about a six-pack, and if you can down that in about a week, you're in good shape. So there's no pressure on you to have any more than you want. Pretty much a beer a day and you're good. And if you have friends over, you can go through it a lot faster than that. So to get the Sub Home Draft Machine, 2 mini kegs of beer, which is equivalent to 2 six-packs, 2 Hopsy glasses, and free membership in the monthly beer club for $99, go to tryhopsy.com/martini and use promo code martini. Terms and conditions do apply. That's spelled tryhopsy.com/martini, promo code martini. All right, Dan, let's move to our bad martini now. And this one cuts right to the heart of the conservative movement here. And we hope that this news isn't going to turn out to be true, but all the signs certainly suggest that it is. Starting with hot air, but also some help from CNN. The Weekly Standard was formed more than 20 years ago by Bill Kristol and Fred Barnes. This afternoon, there are multiple reports, and that's Tuesday afternoon, that the site's owner may be fed up with its turn toward never-Trumpism and looking to go in another direction. From CNN, they say the magazine's precarious position comes after its leadership spent months searching for a buyer. The People explained that the Weekly Standard's leadership had butted heads with Media DC, which is the current publisher of the magazine, and that the two parties had agreed to allow current editor Steve Hayes to search for a new owner. However, Media DC recently informed the Weekly Standard's leadership that the company was no longer interested in a sale. Instead, Ryan McKibben, the chairman of Media DC, asked to meet with Hayes in a meeting tentatively scheduled for late next week. They also requested the entire staff of the Weekly Standard be made available following the meeting. Vox has reported on this as well, so take that with a grain of salt. But basically what they're learning is that Media DC owns two things in the conservative media spectrum, and that's the Weekly Standard and the Washington Examiner. They're pumping a lot of resources and attention into the Washington Examiner, revitalizing a new nationally distributed magazine. They've brought some top talent on board to do that, and perhaps they're going to be focusing their attention there instead of the Weekly Standard. So, Dan, anytime you're in conservative media, whether you particularly like a publication or don't, and obviously the Weekly Standard's become pretty controversial given how Bill Kristol has reacted towards President Trump. It's very hard to watch people have their livelihood threatened when something like this happens. It's part of the business, but it's ugly to see, and especially the Weekly Standard, which over the past 20 years, well before the Trump era began, was a pretty important part of the conservative voice.
Yeah, Greg, there's a lot to be sad about here. Obviously, I have friends, any of us in the media do, and the conservative media do, at the Weekly Standard, and so I'm primarily concerned about them. It's also a real bummer that there's been some kind of infighting sparked between the Examiner and the Weekly Standard, or at least factions therein, as the story unfolds. There's some idea that the Standard is kind of being cannibalized, and its subscriber list is being cannibalized by ownership I don't know if there's any truth to that, but that's part of what's being reported as part of the effort to revitalize the Examiner. So that would be a shame if true. But there are also some sort of lessons here. One, I think the pool of talented writers at the Standard and editors are going to have minimal trouble finding places for their copy. I think there's just a ton of just prose talent there, in addition to the sort of analytical firepower and the knowledge of ideas. There's just a lot of great crackerjack prose writers there, and I don't think they'll have any trouble finding new homes. But of course, it's going to be a process, and it's going to be difficult, and it's going to be sad. And I hope that the Standard survives in some form. I hope that if it even if it has to go away for a little while, that it comes back revived. But there's some lessons to learn here too, which is that one, if I like Bill Kristol. I don't know him well. I've met him a handful of times. Certainly corresponded with him. But I think it's safe to say that his tactics are outside the mainstream, even of critics of the president, and I certainly include myself in that camp. I don't know the extent to which that had anything to do with what's happening here. Of course, Steve Hayes runs the Standard day to day, and Steve is just a really thoughtful, brilliant guy, and a big critic of the president as well. But I think there's a division between people on the right who are critics of the president, who have been able to criticize policies, actions, and ideas, and then a kind of broad anti-Trump animus that extends beyond particular actions. And I think you've seen people who are able to do the former find their way and find a sort of at least provisional home in the broader American right at this odd time and place. And folks who have fallen victim to the latter, and I'm looking at the Jen Rubins of the world, to say the least, have not been able to find a home in the broader right coalition. Some of them aren't interested in a home there. But so that's one lesson here. My plan for them is sort of the Churchill plan, from the Never Surrender speech, when he says, should England or parts of it be conquered, which I don't believe for a second, then, we'll continue fighting from our empire over the seas. Churchill had this whole plan to bring the, capital of the British Empire to Canada and fight the war from there. So I think that the Washington Free Beacon, as a disciple publication of the Standard, with many of the editorial brass there being Standard alum, should absorb the Standard and continue fighting from their empire over the seas. So I hope something like that happens if the news turns out to be true. And better yet, I hope the news isn't true.
We'll see. I guess next week is when we'll find out for sure. But I had a chance to produce a radio program for Fred Barnes for a number of years last decade, and just a wonderful guy, a thoughtful conservative, and it's a good thing that he helped to create here. And I think you're right about not necessarily finding a place when everything's negative about Trump, even when he's doing conservative things. And I think that's one of the things I think that speaks very well of National Review. National Review was out there in 2016 with the Against Trump issue. But once he got elected, when he does things that aren't conservative, you mention it. When he does things that are conservative, you mention that too. And I think that's the honesty that folks are looking for. And hopefully that's the right way to be in this era. I know a lot of folks don't want necessarily nuance, but I think a lot of people still do. Let's move on to our crazy martini now, and back to those who are not running in 2020. Dan, I almost made this the bad martini just because he would have been so much fun yelling "Basta" all over the debate stage with his 47 other Democratic presidential hopefuls. But sadly, attorney Michael Avenatti is not going to run in 2020. Here's his statement. After consultation with my family and at their request, I have decided not to seek the presidency of the United States in 2020. I do not make this decision lightly. I make it out of respect for my family. But for their concerns, I would run. I will continue to represent Stormy Daniels and others against Donald Trump and his cronies, and I will not rest until Trump is removed from office and our republic and its values are restored. I will also continue with my nearly 20 years of speaking truth to power and representing those who need an advocate against the powerful. And then he goes on to say that he wants a real fighter. He likes a lot of the potential candidates, but he's not sure there's a fighter in the mix that can really take on Donald Trump. So, Dan, I can do the math from Monday when you said you were in second grade when George H.W. Bush was running for re-election and did not win. So I can put the math together and realize that 2020 is the first year you're eligible to run. Would you like to make a statement here formally to explain your plans for this upcoming campaign season?
If nominated, I will not accept. If elected, I will not serve. Yeah, I mean, I think the disappointment from just a horse race analysis perspective is that we won't get the kind of acid test of a candidacy like Avenatti's. I don't think he ever had a real chance. I never bought the Trump of the left stuff portrayal of him, but it would have been interesting to see in what, as you said, 47 Democrats in a very crowded field. We saw the way the current president took great advantage of that. Could Avenatti have run, in low double digits, or could he have hung on long enough, knocked some people off, had some sort of surprising growth out on the trail, given a couple big policy speeches and turned the candidacy into something. I don't think there's a great chance of that, but it would have been entertaining to watch, and it would have been an interesting sort of shakedown test of the mood of the Democratic electorate. Certainly, I don't think he's a 51% guy among Democrats, but he would have had a little core of support among angry Democrats, and it would have been interesting to see how long he could have ridden that. Obviously, in reality, the dude is an ambulance chaser who likes to stiff people on their bills, and not a particularly impressive resume. I thought it was interesting that he said he was going to continue representing Stormy Daniels. My first thought was, does Stormy know that, Mike? Because she gave an interview recently to the effect that she wasn't particularly happy with his representation. So it's interesting from that standpoint. But I also do think there's room for somebody like Avenatti. I don't know who that is, but that's the real question that Democrats, both the party establishment and the rank and file, are going to have to decide. Interestingly and ironically, of course, superdelegates are losing power this go round, thanks in part to Bernie Sanders. But that structural change, might open the door again for some sort of wild card candidate. And it'll be interesting to see who that is. And the Democrats have to confront whether they want to sort of run a return to normalcy kind of mainstream candidate, or even if they pick somebody like Gillibrand, who is now very unconvincingly speaking in the vocabulary of the intersectional millennial feminist. She still has mainstream chops and the ability to appeal to a swath of the middle. They could run on that return to normalcy track, or they could go all in and pick their own sort of fighter, as Avenatti says, and turn this thing into a bloodbath. There's still plenty of belief among the left, that Bernie would have won had he been the nominee. So there will be a big temptation to run a sort of hardcore Marxist like that. We've deprived ourselves of a little bit of entertainment. Now that slot on the Democratic side is wide open for somebody else to emerge and fill.
Yeah. I think there's plenty of people considering this who are as crazy as Avenatti, but as bombastic as him. I think that's going to be the tough part to replace, and that's a shame, because we really needed that craziness into the field, especially with so many people like today.
I think the writers made a mistake here. They should have worked out that a little bit more. Should have kept him around at least till the end of the season. Have a spectacular death scene, and then move forward from there.
Oh, Dan, so much fun. Good to be with you again today, and we'll do it again tomorrow. See you then.
Thank you.
Daniel Foster, contributing editor at National Review Online. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Do join us again tomorrow, and between now and then, we hope you have a chance to watch the funeral for President Bush. Also, don't forget that we're sponsored again today by Hopsy for all that good stuff, especially the beer and the glasses and the membership. Try Hopsy.com/martini, promo code martini. Terms and conditions apply. See you again tomorrow, Thursday, on the next 3 Martini Lunch.